Hello, BookTube. Well, it's day 3 of Nonfiction November, and that is a big BookTube event that's hosted by Gemma at Nonfic Books and Olive at A Book Olive, in which they celebrate nonfiction, the reading of nonfiction, which is still the ugly stepsister here on BookTube. BookTube is mostly composed of people talking about fiction. In fact, still, BookTube is mostly composed of people talking about YA fiction. And part of that is just, going along with the crowd. But another part of it is that nonfiction has a bad rap. It has a bad reputation among general interest readers where it's viewed as kind of dry or boring or intimidating. I'm not up enough on a subject to read about it in nonfiction. I'd rather read about it in a novel. I tried to stress in my last video like this a couple of days ago that that isn't explicitly true. You read a long historical novel about Mary Queen of Scots, the first thing you're going to want to know is how much of it was true. And the reason why you're going to want to know that is because there's a big part of your human brain that finds true stories more interesting than made-up stories. And that's where Nonfiction November comes in if you have not read nonfiction, if you haven't read it since school, if you're not accustomed to it, and if maybe you're a little intimidated by it. I thought I would make a video reiterating some points that I've made about reading nonfiction on this channel before for absolute beginners, which I have encountered many times. I have won many people over to the reading of nonfiction for pleasure. It's a bottomless pleasure. It's a lot richer and wider and more rewarding than reading even the best fiction for pleasure. Fiction has its place, and it can move you, but it's also, well, it also has its limitations, as any of you have ever read a crappy novel know. Whereas crappy histories, crappy biographies, crappy works of nonfiction, I think telegraph themselves far more clearly and so are more easily avoided. But one way or another, if you're new to reading nonfiction, if, for instance, you're trying your hand at it for real here in Nonfiction November 2018, I thought I would give some tips that I have made on this channel before. Because nonfiction on any subject can look intimidating. It's so big, it's so sprawling, and there are so many things that you don't know. The minute you start to look into something, you realize how much you don't know. And that's a disheartening feeling for any reader, for any person. And my advice to people in that situation is always the same. Start small. Start with something that really interests you, that already interests you. No matter how poorly you have been trained or taught or exposed to nonfiction in your life, and I guarantee you, almost certainly you have been poorly exposed to it, no matter how poorly that process has happened, something along that line has managed to trigger your interest. Some person, some conflict, some battle, some location has managed to survive the droning ineptitude of the way these subjects have been presented to you when you were first learning how to explore the world of reading. Some subjects have stood out. Some have survived and do interest you. And my advice is to start with those. Start small. Start with a few things. One person, one battle, one location. The approach to this that a great many people take is genealogy, which just necessarily personalizes and limits your field of inquiry to make it feel less intimidating, to make it feel more like something that you can actually do and enjoy and learn something about, which is the whole goal of nonfiction just in general. It's easier to see when it's in the small scale. And although I think nonfiction is just genealogy is just a little bit navel-gazing for my likes. I have often found that people who study their genealogy, as much as my hope might be that they would extend outward from that to study the times and the general life and the people and the larger context, it's been my experience that they tend not to do that. They tend instead to just become droning missionaries on the jot and tittle of their own family tree. And that's almost never interesting. And it's actually a closed loop, so it's the opposite of what I'm recommending here. But it can be a start, maybe, if it's done right. But one way or another, find a subject. Find something that already interests you, and start there. So let's say it's, or who even knows? Let's say the Merry Monarch, King Charles II, an inherently fascinating subject, a king whose father was beheaded, a king who spent most of his boyhood in exile, with the idea of ever returning to his throne, an almost impossibility. He wasn't willing to say it was impossible, but it looked like it was never going to happen. And he was just in exile and living the best life that he could. And then circumstances conspired to bring him back to the throne, to reestablish the monarchy and have him have a grand homecoming and take up residence as the King of England. An event that when he was 18, he would have thought was impossible. So that's, and there were a lot of great personalities in his day. He himself was a charismatic figure. There's a lot of interest there in Charles II. So let's say you pick him as the subject that you want. Where would you start? Well, the first place to start is with a really good detailed overview. You want to know the rough outline of what you're going to be looking into. Fortunately, in decades past, I would have recommended the Dictionary of National Biography, or Chambers Biographical Dictionary, or an encyclopedia, a really good encyclopedia set. Now we have Wikipedia. And a great deal of Wikipedia still comes up for mockery because of how ludicrous it is, how ludicrously wrong it is. But those days are largely over. Most major entries of the millions and millions of entries on Wikipedia are patrolled by experts in that field. And they're patrolled by multiple experts. So if one expert gets it wrong, the others will pounce right away. It's a great system, a self-correcting system. So if you go to the Wikipedia entry for Charles II, you will have a huge amount of information that you can just read there to get a sense of the whole overview of your subject, so that you don't feel like quite the outsider anymore. You don't feel quite so unprepared. So you go to something like Wikipedia. Wikipedia will also have sources. Many of them will be online. So you can go to other websites and read about King Charles II. Read overviews. Read about the major ups and downs of his life, the major currents of thought and politics and whatnot, the famous quotes, the famous controversies and the wars and whatnot. And then when you're done with that, you read that a few times, maybe read a few of the basic sources that are linked from there on Wikipedia, you will have a very good working outline of your subject, something to flesh out your initial interest. Then when you have that, you move on from there to general interest, popular narrative biographies. You want to read biographies of King Charles II next to get a broader view than could possibly be condensed in a Wikipedia article. Like, for instance, Antonia Fraser did a fantastic popular interest narrative biography of King Charles II. So you read that. Maybe look at a couple of others. Jenny Englau did one that was also really good, A Gambling Man. All you have to do to find that is go to Goodreads or Amazon and look around for biographies of Charles II. And look specifically with an eye towards whether or not the biography is pitched for a general interest level of inquiry. Because that's all you have so far. You haven't studied the subject enough to know enough to wade into deeper waters, to wade into monographs or really serious historical studies of King Charles II and his period. You don't know enough about that yet. And there's a great deal of merit in those biographies, obviously. I love them. And I know quite a bit about the reign of King Charles II, to put it mildly. But once you're done with a lot of those biographies, once you start to know not only the rough outline of King Charles II's life and reign, but also the kinds of observations about it that biographers make, then you can move on from there. You can figure what aspects of that reign most interest you. The personal, the sexual, the military. Which aspect, what event, the Popish plot? What is it about? Is there a particular thing in Charles's reign that interests you? No matter what it is, I guarantee you there will be books and articles on it. You can then find them, read them, figure out whether or not they agree or disagree with the broader outlines that you had read before. That's one of the fun. The big part of the fun of reading, especially historical nonfiction, is that you feed your mind until it builds a picture of what you're investigating. But that picture is never solid. Because somebody could come along and say, well, okay, I know what all the historical basis of what you've just read, same as you do, but I say we're reading that historical basis wrong. I say, for instance, that Adolf Hitler was actually an inspired military leader, when everything you've read until then about Adolf Hitler says that he was a disastrously insane military leader who had anyone else been in charge of the military, the World War II might have gone on indefinitely, or certainly gone on differently than it did. That a lot of the biggest and most boneheaded military decisions of the Third Reich were made by Adolf Hitler because he was military incompetent. Let's say you've read 4 biographies of Hitler. They're all huge. And let's say you've read 4 histories of Nazi Germany, or of World War II in general. And all of those together have given you the impression, you've heard it from historians, but you've also gathered the impression on your own that he was just a bad military leader. And then all of a sudden, a credited historian on a major press comes out with a book that says, no, that I know all of that information that you've encountered, same as you do, but I say we're reading it wrong. I have a different interpretation, and I'm willing to argue it with you. That is a thrilling experience. That's a fantastic experience, because you have nothing at stake. You can figure it out one way or another. If the author convinces you, you're convinced. And the author's not going to convince you out of sleight of hand, because you already know a lot of what the author's talking about. So you get to assess the argument. That is tremendous fun. It gives you a sense of being directly involved in what you're reading in a way that fiction cannot duplicate. Even the best fiction cannot duplicate it. The best fiction isn't even interested in duplicating anything like that. Instead, you come to fiction as a tabula rasa. You come to it just flat out. And it builds a world around you in your imagination. And you need to know that world and respond to it. But no one is ever going to challenge that world unless a pastiche writer comes along and decides, look, we all of that was wrong. I know the novel that you read before, and I know the impressions it made on you, but I'm here to tell you I'm going to retell that story, and it's all different. Like a classic example of that being The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. That basically Lestat, the narrator of that novel, tells the reader at the beginning, I know what you read in the previous book, Interview with the Vampire, and most of it is wrong. And now I'm going to tell you the true story. And you still don't know if he's right. They could both be wrong. But one way or another, that almost never happens in fiction. And that happens all the time in nonfiction, where you have a settled opinion based on what you've read. Then an author comes along and says, actually, it was the American forces in World War I that won the war. And if they hadn't shown up, the British and French would have lost to the Germans in World War I. You see that and you say, oh, come on. The American contribution was minimal and belated. That's what I've read in the 6 books that I've read. That's what I've read. But if you're good at reading nonfiction, and you will be, you won't be hidebound, you won't be reactionary, you will say, well, all right, that's the opinion that I have, certainly based on all that I've read, and I think that I've read everything that I've read correctly. But you say otherwise, convince me. I'll read your book, convince me. That is absolutely thrilling. And that happens all over the spectrum of nonfiction once you're involved. That is the goal. That is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow here. That's why you go through the tedium of learning the basics of your study and then studying it a little more, reading a series of books on it. Counting the whole time that your initial interest will bear you out, that you will keep being interested in the subject, whether it's Tudor England or the history of submarines or wolves in the wild or whatnot, whatever it is. We count here on the fact that your initial interest will carry you through all the different levels until before you know it, believe you me, before you know it, you will be pouncing on every new book that comes out, on whatever your subject is, and half of them you will look at and say, well, okay, but this is going to be sort of basic. This author is not really trying to reinterpret things or convince me of anything. He seems to have a kind of a boring prose style. So this whole book on this subject, which I vividly remember only 10 years ago, I would have gobbled it up. I would have loved it. But now I've kind of, as bad as it sounds to the untrained ear, I've kind of moved past it. I know what it is. I know who it's aimed at. And I used to be that person, but I'm not anymore. Whereas a more specialized book comes out on whatever subject it is, the intelligence of octopuses or plate tectonics or whatever. A more specialized book comes out, something from a university press, for instance, where the author is making no bones about the fact that this is not aimed at beginners. Suddenly you'll take to it. It'll just be fantastic. It's exactly what you want to read because it pushes you, it challenges you, and it builds on all the stuff that you have put in time to learn. That will become you. That is the goal at the end of this process, is that for a whole range of subjects, that will be you as a reader. All of a sudden, you will no longer be a beginner. And that's a key difference that nonfiction has with the world of, for instance, fiction. Nonfiction does have ranks. A beginning reader of nonfiction on some subject won't be able to read that advanced book without missing, 70%. Some people do that. I think it's a bad idea. You should respect your level of preparedness for any book and just work to expand it. But when you're reading nonfiction on some subject, there's a beginner level where you know nothing at all really about the subject other than the fact that on some level it interests you. And then there's, the next level where you are reading about it, studying it, learning more about it, getting it all down, the names, the participants, the time period, the general outline of events. And then the level beyond that, where you know your subject and you want to know even more about it. You want to get to know the subject really well. That that kind of progress doesn't really exist when it comes to reading novels. I think that's why novels have such a fundamental appeal to readers, is that they don't really have that process. I think that on some levels they do. But it's anathema to talk that way in most reading circles in the 21st century. To say that you can be a better reader of novels than someone who hasn't read as many as you have is just, you can be hanged, drawn, and quartered for suggesting it. I think it's true. I know for a fact that it's true. I know experienced novel readers who read them better than people who've read far fewer novels. I think that makes just self-evident sense. But it seems to fly in the face of what we even think of when we think of novels. We think of novels as being completely egalitarian. Anybody can approach them at any time and love them and get everything that there is to get out of them. And only the first part of that is true. Anybody can approach them at any time and love them. But to get the most out of them, you have to be more experienced at reading them. I think it just goes hand in hand with just across the reading spectrum. The more experienced you are at reading anything, the better you will be at reading that something. And these are all alien terms for any kind of fiction in the 21st century. In the 21st century now, that would be simply the patriarchy talking or whatever nonsense I would be told to check my privilege. But it still holds true with nonfiction. And it's every bit as true with nonfiction as with any other kind of writing. The more you read of it, the better you will get at reading it. And you will progress in the complexity of what you can read in that type of writing. So for today's pep talk, if that's what these are, I don't know what these are, but if for today's pep talk, if you're just starting out on nonfiction, you're thinking, I've read fiction all this time, but every time I've ever been tempted to read nonfiction, I've thought, I'm missing out on something and I really should explore it, but I don't know where to start. That's where to start. Start small. Pick something small that already interests you. Preferably not your own family tree. Pick something small that already interests you. Some subject that already interests you. It doesn't have to be history or biography. It can be anything. Turtles, for instance. Or the making of books. Or the history of the Beatles. The band, not the insects. Or the insects, I don't know. It worked for Charles Darwin. Pick something small that already interests you. And that may be something that you've always said, I'd like to know more about that. And then proceed to learn more about that in easy steps. Don't push yourself, and try not to put yourself in any position that will make you feel the frustration of being uninformed. Because that's so discouraging. That is so discouraging. I know that feeling. I encounter it all the time. Being uninformed on a subject, coming into it raw, is extremely discouraging. So try to avoid putting yourself in the position where you will feel that. Instead, take baby steps. Start with Wikipedia. Go to the online alternate sources for Wikipedia. Read up on the same outline over and over again until you start to get it. And then move on to popular volumes on that subject. And of course, same thing that I say all the time when we're talking about nonfiction of any kind, is that if I can be of any help, feel free to sing out in the comments field. Let me know if you want a recommendation of something on some subject. I have read very widely on nonfiction. I might be able to help. But one way or another, I wanted to wrap this up for now by just saying that if you're seeing all these Nonfiction November videos in your feed like I am, and you're thinking, I don't even know where to start, it's never too late. In fact, it's the perfect time. It's Nonfiction November, for Pete's sake. So find a subject that already interests you, whatever it is, and let's explore how you can get into it. Until 5-6 years from now, you will know everything there is to know on the subject, and you will be eagerly awaiting the next book on it. Whereas before, you wouldn't have known what to do. That is easy to do, and we can do it together. So we can start here in Nonfiction November. So I'll wrap this up. That was my all-purpose pep talk for today. But we'll talk later, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.